Well, good morning, or for some others, good afternoon or good evening. My name is Marjorie Jean-Pierre, and I'm a Senior Director at the United States Energy Association, and we are pleased that you were able to join us for our final webinar on mini-grid operations in rural communities, challenges and opportunities, and hope you were able to attend 1 and 2 of the webinars in the series. This program is part of the Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, AmpUp program, managed by the U.S. Energy Association and financed by the U.S. Agency for International Development. My organization, U.S. Energy Association, for over 40 years has had the opportunity to collaborate with the U.S. Agency for International Development to provide capacity building assistance to our overseas partners for increased energy security and access by developing and conducting capacity building programs that encourage the sharing of global best practices and exposure to the latest developments, including private sector engagement, market-based approaches to utility operations and management, implementation of regulations, and environmental safeguards. The U.S. Energy Association, in collaboration with a consortium of highly skilled professionals, will be managing an initiative with USAID called the Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, otherwise known as AmpUp. The consortium is comprised of Arizona State University, MK Advisors, NRECA International, and Segura Consulting. AmpUp was developed to introduce an innovative performance improvement model centered around peer-to-peer relationships and strong practitioner and stakeholder networks. This program is funded and supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development, Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. This webinar is being led today by NRECA International, who has also led the other two, and we thank you, and is presented under the AmpUp Technology Webinar Series, which highlights current energy issues being discussed and implemented globally. Our future webinars will be led by each consortium member, and we hope that you will continue to join us for those in the future. Again, thank you for attending, and I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator today, Zoraida Hoffman of NRECA International. Zoraida?
Thank you, Marjorie. Welcome, everyone. My name is Zoraida Hoffman, and I will be your moderator today. And on behalf of NRECA International, welcome to our final discussion titled It's a Business, the third and final session of the webinar series on the challenges and opportunities to operate mini-grids in rural communities. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. There will be an opportunity to ask our panelists questions in the last 20 to 30 minutes of our discussion. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, the Q&A option, and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. And this webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the USEA website in the coming week or so. So we started this webinar series about a month ago with a discussion on what it takes to operate a mini-grid and keep the lights on for the communities they serve. The second session, another group of panelists shared their experiences on why it's important to have community support and buy-in for mini-grids to succeed. And today, for our final discussion, we will cover the challenges and opportunities faced by mini-grid developers, funders, operators, and the utilities themselves to successfully operate a business and provide lasting power to the rural communities. As we all know, there are still about 500 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have access to electricity. The good news is renewable mini-grids are becoming more accessible and affordable to bring power to this region. However, as our panelists know well, there are many recipe ingredients needed for the success and sustainability of mini-grids. So let's meet our panelists who will talk about this and other business aspects of operating mini-grids whose priority at the end of the day is to provide reliable and affordable electricity to consumers at the end of the line. So first, we have Lamide Ngi Afuye, CEO of AMDA, the Africa Mini-Grid Developers Association. Welcome, Lamide. AMDA is a trade association that represents private utilities developing renewable and localized power grids, and currently AMDA has about 42 members across 19 African countries. Prior to this role as CEO, Lamide was the strategic advisor to the CEO of Mainstream Energy Solutions Limited, West Africa's leading hydropower generation company. So welcome, Lamide. Next, we have Anita Otubu, Senior Director for the Universal Energy Facility for SE for All. Before joining SE for All, Anita was previously the head of the project management unit of the Nigeria Electrification Project under the Rural Electrification Agency. This project's goal is to accelerate the private market for the development and deployment of mini-grids. We also have with us James Knuckles, Senior Energy Access Consultant at the World Bank. Hi, James. For more than a decade, James has supported ESMAP, the World Bank supported ESMAP and World Bank investments in mini-grid and off-grid electrification in more than a dozen countries. He is the co-author and lead editor of the 2022 World Bank Handbook on Mini-Grids, titled, thank you, Mini-Grids for Half a Billion People, and co-author of the 2014 World Bank book on small power producers called From the Bottom Up. We're going to hear more about this during our conversation. And Charles, I'm very happy to introduce him, Charles Matovu, the General Manager of the Kigegwa Rural Electricity Cooperative Society, or CREX, an electric co-op in Uganda. Charles, could you turn on your camera for just a moment? We're trying to get better connectivity for Charles. There he is. Hi, Charles. CREX is located about 190 kilometers west of Kampala, serves about 11,000 connections to the national grid and about 183 connections to a solar-powered mini-grid in Katirwe, a village with cattle herding and dairy production about 20 miles west from CREX's main office in Kigegwa. And finally, where are you, Frank? Oh, there you are. We have my colleague, Frank Berg, who is a senior electric engineer for NRECA International, a nonprofit organization based in the United States. NRECA International was established about 60 years ago with a mission to bring power to communities around the world using lessons learned from the US electric co-op movement that today serves about 42 million consumer members in the US. So that was a long one. Thank you, each of you, for taking the time to be with us today. So let's just get into it. Let's see. Yes, the participants are still coming in. That's all right. We can just begin, and I'll give some reminders as we go through our conversation today. I'm going to begin here by setting the stage with a World Bank announcement earlier this year, which stated that to meet SDG 7, Sustainable Development Goal number 7, powering 380 million people in Africa by 2030 will require the construction of more than 160,000 mini-grids. And at the current pace today, only 12,000 new mini-grids serving about 46 million people will be built by 2030. That's not happy news. So to begin this, I'd like to ask the audience to respond to a poll question that we've prepared. And let's see, if one of my colleagues from USCA could put it up, and I'll ask, there it is, I'll ask the question, and it's on your screen. What is the biggest barrier for mini-grid projects to succeed? Is it insufficient financial reserves, poor design, policies and regulations, imprecise load forecasting, or non-cost reflective tariffs? Again, pick one. And the question again is, what is, in your opinion, is the biggest barrier for mini-grid projects to succeed? So go ahead and make your choices. And I believe when that comes through, we can see the results. And we'll just take a look to see where we are. Oh, and I just see here that the panelists cannot vote on this, so you all cannot participate in this as much as I know you want to, but you'll be able to talk about it, which is great. So will we be able to see the results on screen? That's about, I'm not the expert here, but based on the many conversations I've had with each of you, this seems to be on target. Yeah, got it. Hang on, I'm going to, just so I'll remember what it says. All right, so let's start, shall we? I see the audience is still rolling in. That's fine. We have a lot to cover today. So James, I'd like to start with you. As you held up that book, you're one of the co-authors of this mini-grid for 500 million people, which I found fascinating, not that I read every word of it. Um, it's filled with, as you know, research-based ingredients, right, of what is needed to successfully establish and sustain mini grids to solve this amazingly huge power problem in Africa. So I'd like for you to get the conversation rolling by sharing with us what you learned from this, and where do you think the industry is right now towards finding the right balance to at the end of the day establish multitudes of mini grids as successful businesses. Kick us off here, James.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zoraida, and it's a pleasure to be here. Speaking with everyone today. It's great to see so many attendees. It's really exciting that there's a lot of interest in mini grids. We tend to think that it's this like niche within a niche. So when we have a nice event like this and it's well attended, it's great. So you'll see a smile on my face for that. Look, this was the book that I held up, Mini Grids for 500 million People. Get your copy today for free. Was a big undertaking. And I think it's difficult to boil it down, into some sound bites, but let me try, and then we can unpack them, during the course of the discussion and the Q&A. So maybe the first thing to say is that mini grids are not a new phenomenon, right? They've been around for decades. In fact, the very first mini grid was built at the end of the 1800s in New York. That was the very first power system that was interconnected. And since then, mini grids have expanded their geographic footprint to cover all four corners of the planet. We were able to identify around 21,000 mini grid systems that were installed around the world. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're operational, but they're certainly installed. And another 29,000 that are planned for construction over the next few years. The 21,000 mini grids that have been built are by and large what we would consider first and second generation systems. So they're usually powered by diesel. They're built as one-off projects. Maybe there's quite a large number of small hydro, mini and micro hydro projects in there. But almost all of the mini grids that are being planned are what we would consider a third generation mini grid. So actually more than 99% of all of the planned mini grids are going to be powered by solar with battery backup, battery storage, and maybe a diesel generator as a backup for those rainy days. So solar is definitely the power choice of the future in terms of the planned mini grids. We're seeing smart meters. We are seeing remote monitoring capabilities. So the technology is changing. We're also seeing projects being rolled out as part of our portfolio rather than one-off, and that's adding to economies of scale, which is helping to bring down the cost. So the first thing to say is that mini grids are not a new phenomenon. There's lots of them out there, and even more being planned. And the ones that are being planned are, these sort of modern mini grids that are being built around the world actually right now today. The second thing to say is about who's building them. So right now, in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America, there's a cohort of private sector companies that are capable and committed to building these high quality renewable energy mini grid systems to provide affordable, reliable electricity. And they're capable of doing this almost at scale. And I say almost at scale because we'll get to this in a second. It's sort of like, a 10, 20, maybe 50 projects at a time, right? But they're still building portfolios of these projects. So there's a cohort of capable private sector companies that are able to do this. And at the same time, I think it's worth saying that public utilities are also a part of this market, right? So in Africa, you have KPLC, you have the EEU in Ethiopia, you have Nigelec in Niger, although they have some political challenges, post-coup, but suffice it to say that at least there are some countries where the national utility is also one of the leaders in terms of building these mini grid systems. So that's not so. The sort of mini grids are not new. Then there's who's building them, and then the last thing is, and this is how we get to scale, right? So we've looked across our portfolio, which spans at last count, I think 30 countries and $1.4 billion committed to mini grids. This is at the bank. We've looked across that portfolio and also looking back historically to sort of try to unpack what's worked, what helps projects move and whatnot. And we've tried to synthesize this into what we would call these building blocks that need to be in place for a mini-grid program to be successful. And it's worth going through them really quickly. So the first one is bringing down costs and getting the technology right. The second one is using geospatial planning and geospatial tools, that the latest GIS technology for national scale planning and also portfolio planning. So at the level of the individual portfolio of mini-grids. The next one is ensuring that these mini-grids are providing access to productive uses of electricity, not just serving households. And going hand in hand with that, it's treating communities as valued customers and not, flying in a team and then flying out and just wiping your hands off it, right? And I understand this was something that was discussed in one of your earlier webinars, that community engagement aspect is really key. So then there's, we need to have a private sector that's also collaborating with the public sector. So these public-private partnerships. We need access to finance. We need exceptional talent and training. So again, this ties in nicely with the USAID program that you were mentioning earlier. We need a supportive institutional structure. We need the right regulations and policies, and we need to be able to cut red tape so that it becomes easier to do business as a mini-grid developer. So if you can put these 10 building blocks in place, then you can start to see scale in mini-grid projects around the world.
Well, you make it sound so simple, but it's not, as we know, right? I mean, you have the recipe. So with that, thank you for that, James. That pretty much gives us an outline for the discussion today. Lamide, I'd like to move on to you, if I could. So AMDA is in such a good position to connect all the stakeholders that James mentioned, right? From the government, the utilities, the funders, the developers, to help create this, the very important enabling environment for all these pieces to fit and for mini-grids to succeed. Can you share with us why AMDA's role is important to help overcome these barriers and what you think is needed to sustain or replicate the successes when it happens?
Thanks a lot, Zoraida. And I think firstly, I'd like to say, for me, it's actually a pleasure to be on the same panel as James Knuckles. When I was joining the sector three months ago now, that book, Mini-Grid for 500 million People, was the reference point, in addition to the work that AMDA had done for, what is, even understanding what is mini-grid. I'm coming from, obviously, a different background. So just being able to have a sort of one-stop reference point to guide. But let me go to what AMDA's role in the sector has been and what AMDA's role will continue to be, or maybe how we see the sector moving forward. And I think it sort of spills from the points that James made about starting from the building blocks. But AMDA has played a unique role as a convener of various stakeholders. And I think more importantly, the consolidated voice for mini-grid developers. And as James said, really, it's, you have a group of capable people. I always use the expression that mini-grid developers can build sites in their sleep, but there's a lot of things that need to work around them to make sure that it makes some sense for the sacrifices that are being made, going far into rural communities in some of the most remote parts of the continent. In my short time here, I've been privileged to go to a few of these sites, and I know that it takes a lot to keep somebody motivated to want to do this work. So overall, I think in our assessment, we've done an assessment of where we think the sector really is. Some progress has been made, but what I think we've been able to assess that some of the major challenges fall within the 4 big buckets, which is broadly speaking, I think the scale is the big challenge, obviously. Many of our mini-grid developers today are startups. And so if you speak to a few of them, they'll tell you that they're speaking to so many various funders who are making multiple requests of them, and there's a challenge for that, and maybe some of the requirements are a little bit stringent in terms of we're trying to build here, and we're being asked to become like Forbes rated companies from day one. Lack of acceptance, broadly speaking, I think there's been a strong, in some countries, I'd say Nigeria, now we're seeing some good political will in Zambia. There's been some acceptance, but I think universal acceptance has been a challenge. In some cases, consolidated efforts has also been a challenge, where multiple people doing a lot of things. But I think maybe we could do more. We could do more in terms of coordination. And then the last bucket, which we've done an assessment of, is a lack of standardization. So a comprehensive understanding of what are the templates to be used to assess performance, what are the standards required for the sector as a whole. And for us to achieve this audacious challenge of universal access to sustainable, reliable, affordable, and modern energy for all by 2030, which is the big picture. And according to the same mini grids for 500 million people, this 91 billion that is required to come into the sector is that business as usual cannot continue. So we've done an assessment, and we've come up with what we think are the solutions, and AMDA's role in driving those solutions. So if you like, the mini grid 2.0 and the AMDA 2.0, and they fall under 4 broad categories. One is capacity building for our developers. Again, the first thing I said was many of our developers say they're being asked for too much too soon. Let's work together as a collective and see how we can streamline requirements. But we also need the developers to be ready for the scale. Access to capital is a big challenge. And for us, our outlook is for us to attract 91 billion into the sector. We need long-term patient capital in forms of multiple streams of funding for the pension funds to come in. The grant providers are always useful to de-risk the sector, but we need a pool of funding to come in. From a policy and regulatory standpoint, we definitely need for governments to embrace mini grids as a cost-effective way of powering and closing the electrification gap in all the countries in Africa, especially the ones with the biggest electrification gaps. And finally, before I pass it on to you, is generally speaking, we need more data in the sector. The mini grids for 500 million people is a great starting point, but AMDA's role really will be to drive data going forward, make data accessible to people. We're going to work closely with you, James, to make sure that data is more accessible and the mini grid sector is understood in the same way as other sectors are. I think that's important. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's our broad outlook of the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm reminded how that we can potentially talk about this for a very long time, over a few days, but we don't have that. So I'll move on. And I really am interested in getting everybody's perspective here. And I want to move on to you, Frank. So for those of you who don't know, NRECA International is involved in mini grid development from the early planning stages to with the national strategic electrification planning, the design, construction of distribution systems. And Frank, you've had involvement in all of these aspects, I think. And of course, and also helping to the point of capacity building, right? To help operators build their knowledge capacity on how to operate mini grids well. So in your experience in working with all this at your time at NRECA or even before, share with us what your thoughts are on how we can ensure the sustainability of a project. I know we're talking about scale here, and we're involved in, a few projects at a time. But in your knowledge, how do we make sure that they stick around for a long time, that they're sustainable for a long time?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I think there's a humble answer to that question is we need to have a learning orientation, because as James mentioned, these third generation mini grids, many people on this call probably have children older than these mini grids. They're new, and so it's hard to give an answer today of what's going to help these mini grids to stand the test of time when the median age of them is like 4 years old. They're new. So even many of the components haven't even run through their useful life yet. But I would say that given that it's a young population and given that we have some historical track record and we've worked intimately with these, some of the pitfalls that we've seen are, there's a tension between, a financial model for certain rates of return that would impress a private sector investor and the, subsistence economies in which these systems are being built. Making overly optimistic load growth projections can definitely get projects in trouble in terms of their ability to deliver over the long term on their investments. And also we find that some of the ways in which these projects are funded, which it's great that these projects are being funded, and I'm excited to hear Anita's remarks specifically on that. But if the projects are funded in a way that front loads money into the capex, we're really trusting the operators to make sure that there's adequate budgeting in the opex. What that means is, is there a reserve account for if a major component fails? Is everything covered under warranty? Are we buying products that are up to the challenge of the last mile, in rural sub-Saharan Africa, which many of the products that are being purpose built for these remote applications don't have the longevity, history, and track record of the type of product that's being used, in the global north in an urban environment. Those are more robust, but also more expensive. And so where do we kind of grapple with the right product for the job and also the right management, for whatever may come in the future? A couple other key points. James mentioned them with his introduction, but recruitment and retention of skilled operations staff. There's also a tension between reaching scale both on a portfolio basis, how many grids can we operate at a time, as well as the individual project size, how large of a grid can we operate. The vast majority of mini grid developers are just operating low voltage, but as those companies make the jump into medium voltage, as recently has been necessary in Sierra Leone and Democratic Republic of Congo and other countries where we have operators for the first time dealing with medium voltage systems, which are way more dangerous to operate, potentially fatal, require years and years of training to be able to do so skillfully. And very few of these organizations are getting the type of training and resources necessary to do so effectively, creating risk, both reputational risk and literally a safety risk, to these young companies in the sector while trying to deliver results under a lot of pressure from their investors and policymakers, et cetera. So I think, and then one other last thing is just the tariffs. So if the regulatory system is supportive of cost reflective tariffs, all of these mini grids have a better chance of succeeding long term. And when there's drastic changes in the regulatory structure that limits, the ability to charge an agreed upon tariff, then it's likely to put the mini grid under a lot of stress and could potentially lead to lack of sustainability. So those are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And this is a good time to bring in Charles. Charles, I know we were having some connectivity or network issues with Charles Matoru from CREX in Uganda. There you are. So I think it's great to have Charles here because he brings the important on the ground perspective to this discussion, right? It's people like him who operates a mini grid and a utility, and in this case, an electric co-op, to get his views in as part of the conversation as well. So can you share with us, Charles, your perspective? And you've heard what James and Lamide and Frank have said, and we'll hear from Anita soon too. Can you share your perspective on what is important for operating a mini grid as a business? Because essentially that's what it is. Okay, we can't hear you, Charles. You know what? Why don't you turn your camera off again so we can hear your voice?
I'm Edbo, and you can hear me well. Thank you so much.
There we go. Okay, yeah. So we know what Charles looks like. Let's be able to hear.
Thank you so much, Hoffman.
Thank you.
Yeah. Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to start by thanking the organizers for this webinar and bring people like Charles from Uganda in one of the rural areas that I'm able to share the experience on the ground. I think key to note in this, Hoffman, is that CRECs have been in operation as a mini grid for the last 1+ months, and I have quite a fair experience about the operation of mini grid. And key to note is about the bring on board the potential customers, mobilizing them ahead of time, educating them about power, and making them ready to utilize the mini grid service. This is very key, making sure that the mini grid works out as a business. Because once you put up a mini grid without ready customers, ready people to use, a big challenge. So one key important lesson that we have come to learn is that we need to prepare our communities. The areas we set the mini grids in, we need to mobilize them ahead of time, educate them about electricity, the services of the mini grid, and then they get ready for the service. Second to note is the capacity of the operator. Yes, CREC's background is that we have been having about 10 years experience in managing the grid from the national grid, making connections, managing the national grid, networks, infrastructures. But what is the experience of the operator in managing the mini? We need to see services that are reliable to the customer, especially when it comes to the, like ours, which is a solar hybrid system. People expect us to be having a 24/7 power reliability. So is the operator able, having capacity enough, to make sure that he maintains the mini grid in the right condition to serve their purpose? This is very key in making mini grids really a real business for us as operators. 3, the rate.
Yes, we can barely hear you.
I'm sorry, my network, like is not quite
that's
well.
quite all right. That's quite all right. Let's do this. Why don't you wrap up the last point I think you were trying to make, and then I'm going to move on to Anita to talk about the next topic, which will also involve you.
Yes. Thank you so much. I was going to talk about having the right tools and materials to use new operations is very critical, and also the availability of service providers to support you in the operations is very important. And lastly, having a favorable enabling tariff that can support you to generate revenue to manage the day-to-day operations and maintenance of the mini. This helps once it's available to make the business quite real. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, thank you. And we'll be able to talk more about this further down the conversation too. So with that, Anita, as I was starting to say, I'd really like to get into the productive uses of electricity part of this conversation about this topic. And I think each one has mentioned the importance of that you can't just go into a community and leave. We have to appreciate the social value of the communities that we go in to help empower. So can you share with us your views and your work and experience about why it's important for the stakeholders like funders and developers and people in this room really to help these communities who receive power learn more about how to use it to increase the revenue stream for their businesses, and if you think that there are gaps in this area that could be improved?
Thank you. I think overall, it's important for the sustainability of these mini grids. I think that's a major objective for most, if not all, mini grid developers, to ensure that the mini grids that are being built can be operated for 10 to 15 year, possibly even longer period of time. But this can only be done if you can see a return on your investment, if the business is profitable, if the end users who are consuming the power are able to actually afford to pay and able to pay for the electricity that's being consumed. Now, where the productive use comes into it is with regards to load consumption. If the end users are not consuming that much power. That means minimal revenue, minimal revenue for the mini grid developers. And therefore, it would obviously take a longer time for them to be able to pay back their investors in terms of the finance that's been put into building out these projects. So from two perspectives, it's important for the end user in terms of promoting or empowering them from an economic standpoint, engaging them in economic activities so that they can improve their means of livelihood and ultimately be able to pay for the power that's being consumed. It's also important for the developers because it just means that there's going to be an increase in consumption and therefore more revenue for them. So it works both ways. And it's really important that, especially from an RBF point of view, where we're providing grants, subsidies to these private sector companies to be able to build out projects that are viable or to bridge that viability gap, it's important that we're not just seen to be helping private sector companies sort of fill their pockets, but also to ensure that we're making more of an impact for the end users as well. We're actually changing their lives too. We're helping them with overall development within their communities. So this is really key. However, with regards to who is responsible for I guess, deploying or rolling out productive use equipment and appliance programs, the question really is whether it should be the responsibility of the mini-grid developers or a separate entity. These mini-grid developers, they're new, they're up and coming. They're just trying to figure out how to even make the mini-grid work itself, right? And how to ensure that the end users are able to just pay for the basic power supply that's being consumed. And when you add another layer to their business model, sometimes it makes it a bit more complicated. And you find that a number of these companies aren't so willing at this point, to take that on board. So I think there's a role for, I don't know whether it's a development partner, another separate entity to come in, who will roll out these projects, probably working alongside microfinance banks who are willing to take on this risk, because typically the end users probably won't be able to pay for productive use appliances and equipment outright. There would be like a payment structure. And we're talking about those at the bottom of the pyramid as it concerns access to finance. There will be need for an entity who's willing to take on that risk in, having this payment structure that can take years to probably pay off. This is, I guess, a bit of a loophole or gap. Some programs in the past have tried to roll out productive use equipment and appliances in conjunction with the mini-grid programs, but it hasn't always shown real successful results, to be honest with you. So I feel like there's a long way to go, but it is certainly an important aspect of being able to successfully operate a mini grid. But the question really is to do with who should be responsible for rolling out these projects. And at the same time, sorry, there's so much to speak on when talking about productive use equipment. Some of these programs come after the mini grids have been built. And if you haven't factored in some of these loads into the initial design of the mini grid before you build out these mini grids, it can have, a detrimental effect on the operation of these mini grids or the effectiveness of the mini grids. And so, yeah, I don't feel like there's a blueprint, and I feel like there's a work that can be done, across development partners, IFIs, and private sector companies. To figure this out.
So what I'd like to do, and you make very good points, and what I'd like to do is Charles, if I could bring you back into here for a second. And Charles and I have talked a number of times over the past year about since and with Frank too, since the completion of the mini grid construction, right, in Katirwe. And we've talked about, Charles and I've talked about the changes in the community as a result of the mini grid. And so, Charles, I'd like for you to share some of that information with the audience here about about Katirwe and how the power has changed just over the last year and a half or so, and how electricity has impacted the community and created these revenue streams with with businesses, and specifically since it's a very agriculture-based community, farming and dairy production. Can you share with us a little bit, visually, or what you see when you go visit the town or the village? What has been some of the changes that you've seen that really speaks a lot to what Anita has just mentioned as well? Let's see if we can have. There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Hoffman. Thank you, Hoffman, for that question. Really, it's very important to share this, and I want to say that there is quite a positive impact that we have so far witnessed within Katiro community since the time we started giving service. Once we started operating this mini grid, a lot has happened. And remember, as a COP, it's all about people. It's all about people, the socio-economic welfare of our people. Yes, money comes in, but most importantly is the people. How do they live? How is the lifestyle changing? And as we talk now, we are seeing a lot of changes in terms of population growth because of the service in the area. We are seeing basic services like small health facilities, clinics being established in the area because there's a service. Educational facilities, the small few schools around it are utilizing power to give students and their pupils time to do revisions at night. We are seeing youth employment, a number of value additional facilities like maize mills and milk coolers have been brought on board. We are seeing a number of youth being engaged in welding workshops. So a lot has changed. Besides other issues like security of the area, the night security of the area has greatly improved. And this has changed even the value of the land around that area because there is an amenity that is not in any other rural area like Katiro. So quite a lot mini grid has influenced an improvement in the socio-economic welfare of the people of Katiro. Yeah, I was saying that what is very key to note also in this, however much we're talking about the positive impacts, we have limitations into that because as the population increases, as the productive use of electricity is getting on board, we have limitations in terms of the load capacity to meet the demand. Like, so many people are out there saying that please let us get us on board to have also access to power. But these mini grids have limitations in terms of capacity. So this is quite another issue that probably we need to discuss and explore further in this kind of discussion webinar. Thank you so much, Zulaida.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, I'm going to move on because we have a lot of ground to cover. Before I do that, though, I just want to remind the potentially latecomers to the conversation that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And I already see a bunch of questions have come in, and thank you, James, for responding to some of them. And use that just for the questions, for the panelists. And the chat is if you want to make comments, that's great, but let's keep the questions to the Q&A section. Anyway, moving on. We talked a lot about funding and finance, so I wanted to sort of get into that a little bit. And Lamide, I'm going to start with you for this section if I could. And of course, anybody else, will please, if you want to add into each other's comments, I welcome my panelists to do so. As I said, and even with the poll, that access to finance or capital is seems to be the top of everybody's list. Everything I've read and everybody that has talked to on what it's needed the most to establish mini grids to scale, especially, right? So, Lamide, can you share with us what you would like to see in terms of a successful model in terms of financial structure for these successful mini grids?
Thanks a lot, Zoraida. So if I start with what I would like to see, I think I'll start with maybe the reference points, which is, for us to achieve SDG 7, which is universal access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. We need at least 160,000 mini grids built sustainably to power 380 million people. According to the World Bank's report, that means at least 91 billion needs to come into that sector, into the sector. So that's a good starting point. But in what form are we talking about? I think naturally, the grant providers provide the avenue, the initial avenue for the investors to flood in, if you like. And we're still very much a new sector. I know mini grids have been in existence for quite some time, but within Africa, it's still being tested. And so in the ideal mix of capital we would like to see is, first of all, for mini grids to be funded as infrastructure, which means, as Anita said, to serve for over 25 years. So we want to see long-term funding. We want to see funding in terms of equity. We want to see funding in terms of cheaper debt, perhaps local currency funding, because many of these companies, whilst may be highly exposed to foreign exchange on the equipment side, their revenues are in Naira. So naturally, cheap local currency funding will be useful. And when we talk about cheap local currency funding, we're talking about pension fund money, insurance money, climate funding is important. And I would say maybe lastly, carbon credits. You know, if mini grids are being built with renewable energy, it means that they're doing a lot in supporting our climate change efforts, our net zero efforts. So essentially, I think people who are investing in these sustainable means of electrification should be compensated in some form for the work they're doing. So I'll stop there, maybe let other panelists chime in, but that is the dream world. And I think my last point is the vision would be to see mini grid developers starting to list on public stock exchanges, creating a separate maybe board for them to be able to access public money. I think that would be a mid to long-term dream for us as AMDA. Thank you.
So before I go on to the next question, I wanted to bring up James or Anita or Frank. Do any of you want to add on to that, or are we good? So I'm gonna put one of you on the spot here. We were talking about tariffs earlier, right? I think a couple of you mentioned this, and from what we've seen is that a lot of these communities, especially those that receive electricity access for the first time through mini grids, and they often cannot afford the tariffs without, and that will cover the full cost of the operations, right? So, and in the US, you know, way back when, 80, 90 years ago, we certainly had help here with loan programs from the government and many different avenues for to cover the cost. But in Africa, what can one of you, James, I might put you on the spot here. What role does government play to provide capital relief for both, you know, utility developers and also the consumers? Can you chat with us a little bit about that?
Sure, thanks. And I think it builds nicely with what Lamide was talking about,
Right.
Because it really is the complete package, the complete financial package that you need to have in place in order to make the mini grid portfolio or project viable. So when I say complete package, right, I'm talking about debt, equity, ideally results-based grants, right? And then often not often, but we're starting to see trickling in are some risk mitigation mechanisms that are able to address, excuse me, we're able to address some of the risks that developers are facing when they're operating in very, very challenging markets. So the role for government in this complete package is, I think, manifold. So on the one hand, having a strong champion, and here, you know, Anita has sat in this chair, right, at REA, but having a strong champion for mini grids in a particular country, a government champion for mini grids in a particular country makes a huge difference, because they can help open doors. They can act as a go-between for developers and different ministries, planning boards, right? Having that champion is really critical. So if you can have a strong institutional setup with a strong champion for mini grids, I mean, that can make a lot of difference. There's also policies and regulations that can make it easier or harder for mini grids to do business and to raise capital, particularly international capital, if they want to go to raise international capital, if they have headquarters outside of the country. Sometimes it's challenging. They have to set up subsidiaries or special purpose vehicles that makes it more challenging to do. It just lengthens the process, right? So there's a role for government in creating an enabling environment for mini grid developers in order to raise capital. And then also directly providing finance, obviously, not obviously, but hopefully results-based finance. So with working alongside development partners like the World Bank or bilateral partners or African Development Bank or many others, the UEF, right, can REAs and government ministries, can they partner with these development partners to offer a results-based grant program that channels money directly to this cohort of capable private sector companies that I was talking about, so that they can deliver the services, these necessary services, to the communities in need at a price that's affordable to these communities. When you could put all that together, then you can start to see projects happening and starting to roll out at scale. And so we've seen, Husk Power, Engie, Renuvia, PowerGen, right? There are some mini grid developers who are, it's a long slog, but they're able to try to, work with governments and put this financial package in place in order to build out portfolios of mini grids.
Yes, please go ahead, Anita. Oh, here, let Anita go first, and I'll get you, Lamide.
So absolutely agree with everything Lamide and James has said. I just wanted to mention with regards to the tariffs, in terms of the role that government can play in ensuring that it's affordable for the end user. First of all, it's important that tariffs are cost reflective. So I wouldn't say, there needs to be, a cap per se. However, I think governments have a role to ensure that where grants are being provided, that it's reflected in the calculation of the tariffs, which should ultimately drive down the cost for the end user. Sometimes with some regulations, unfortunately, that requirement is not there, and the grants are often taken as equity. And so therefore, it's not necessarily reflected in the tariff in terms of making these tariffs affordable for the end user. So I guess government or the regulators playing more of an active role to ensure as best possible that these grants are taken into consideration for the benefit of the end users. But as I mentioned earlier, while still ensuring that these tariffs are cost reflective, because we want to encourage our private sector companies to build out these projects within their countries.
Thank you. And Lamide, you look like you had something else you wanted to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to give some sort of practical example of a personal experience I had when I went on a site visit to one of our developers in rural Abuja, which is the capital city of Nigeria. Now, speaking of enabling environment, it goes in multiple forms. It's not just in tax incentives or having a strong rural education agency. It's as practical as even building a road. It took us almost 2 hours to get to a place which was ideally maybe a 30-minute journey. And some of our developers explained to us that, in some instances, the truck that was used to deploy like their solar PVs to the sites in these very remote parts of the capital city, it could take 4 days to get there, and for every single day they're paying. First of all, they're not gonna meet some of Anita's requirements, because there's a timeline towards deploying certain things by a certain time. From the perspective of the end user, the rural community, one of the ladies said, since this mini grid was installed, we've been able to achieve 24 hours electricity. All we need now is a good road. So enabling environment goes in multiple forms, just as simple as building the infrastructure that would enable a mini grid developer reach those hard to reach areas in our communities. I always say in some parts of Nigeria, there's life beyond the grid, but there's no lights beyond the grid. So enabling environment will allow us to take light beyond the grid. Thanks.
I was trying to write very quickly. That was a great quote, Lamide. Does anybody else want to add to that before we move on? Frank, do you have something you wanted to say?
No, I'll pass. I think the comments have been very,
Yeah,
very complete.
that actually answered a lot of, at least the questions that I had in my mind that I was curious about. I want to sort of stick to the regulations part of this because I think it's interesting, and plus, each country has its own unique set of challenges, right? Oh, not necessarily just challenges, but it's just different. Each country in the African continent can have different regulations, different needs and requirements, and also opportunities, really. And I think of, and Anita, you're very familiar with this, in Nigeria, it seems that it's had more success in building and establishing mini grids than some of the other countries. So I'm curious, I mean, this is either for you, Anita, or maybe Lamide, or anybody really, is there like a common thread for developers or funders that can use some of these successes as examples to learn from, or is that too unique? Help me understand that, and the audience too, a little better, if that's possible.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Nigeria does have a really good regulation that promotes private sector investment and participation in the mini grid space, ensuring that should the main utility who has license to operate within that jurisdiction extend to a mini grid community, that mini grid developer should be compensated in one way or the other, whether it's financially or whether it's to do with entering into some sort of arrangement or agreement for an interconnected interconnected mini grid situation where I guess the main grid can utilize the existing infrastructure of the existing mini grid that's there to I guess ensure supply of electricity to those end users. However, it goes beyond, from my own experience, it goes beyond having a regulation in place that addresses these aspects. There's need for the actual regulators themselves or the officials who are responsible for enforcing these regulations, who are responsible for evaluating applications that come in for permits to build out these mini grids, to fully be on board and to understand the urgency of the sector, and the fact that you can't take 12 months to evaluate an application before you give a permit, because sometimes some of these funds, as Lamide had mentioned, I have deadlines with regards to when I can disperse funds. And if I don't disperse it, it goes back to my donors, right? Why the Nigeria Electrification Project, which was funded by the World Bank and the African Development Bank, why it worked so well in Nigeria was because not only were 2 dedicated staff funded to sit in the regulatory office to evaluate these applications and fast track these applications, we also had to develop an online sort of portal for applications to be uploaded from the comfort of one's home or office, to avoid companies having to go physically into the offices of the regulator. That takes time as well. And it helped to easily also track where your application was in the process too, and sort of mount a bit of pressure on the regulator to ensure that deadlines are adhered to as per their regulations and their own sort of manuals that are in place. So yes, it's one thing having a great regulation, it's another thing having the people behind it to ensure that it works. So is the answer for the World Bank to continue funding individuals to sit in regulatory offices to fast track these applications? I wouldn't say that is the answer, because it's just not sustainable. We just need to build capacity. So perhaps more technical assistance funding channeled towards building the capacity of the existing officers within these regulatory within the the regulator's office to effectively issue out permits within short timeframes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, I see a whole bunch of questions coming in, and I'm mindful of time here. I do want to bring in Charles and Frank back into the conversation here about ownership. And, you know, is it important to have local ownership? I mean, in the previous webinar, we talked about community buy-in. And, you know, the co-op model, of course, the community owns the power that they receive. Charles, you and I talked a little bit about this too, and Frank and I have worked for a bit now on the electric co-op development side of the business, right? But I'd like to hear from Charles if he could tell us, you know, tying into what everybody has said so far, is, you know, how important it is to have local ownership or investment in these mini grid projects. And in talking about making sure that it can last 20, 25 years, you know, the continuity, when the regulations sometimes require majority owners or investors from for-profit international organizations. You know, there's a huge mix here, and I'd like to hear from somebody on the ground here for a minute. What is your thought behind that, Charles?
Yeah, thank you, Zulaida. I think I want to start from the background that CRECS is a cooperative society, and we build our strength from the concept of user-owned, user-managed, user-controlled. So it's quite very important to see local community taking charge of their own infrastructures and involvement. This has a lot from our past experiences, both from the mini grid perspective and even from the national grid, where we have had some quite good time of experience, is that once people are brought on board to own and manage their own facility, there is a lot that is coming in. One, there is a limitation in terms of vandalism, because people take charge of protecting, of using their own infrastructure. This is quite different in areas where we see donors leading the infrastructure, the projects. Once communities are brought on board, they try to guard against anything that is wrong on the infrastructure. This is quite very important in terms of sustainability, because people are owning and are ready to take charge of anything. Two, once that is done, it minimizes the operational cost, because people are taking their own interest into the project, into the infrastructure. So the operator, now you get an opportunity of reducing on the cost that you try to inject in terms of maintaining the mini grid. So this is critical, very critical. And once people are part of, they know that the benefit, the return from it still goes back to them. This increases their willingness to use the service of the mini grid.
Zoraida, can I comment on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, that's an area where I think the sector has a lot of room to grow in terms of local ownership and participation. You know, local, these infrastructure needs to be locally accountable, you know, to the people who derive power from it, and they should be reasonably assured, you know, of high power quality and affordable prices. That's the purpose of energy access. We'd be falling down in our you know, roles if we did this otherwise. Nevertheless, because of the, I think, heavy reliance in today's industry on the private sector led mini grid development and deployment, the way to get these systems financed is to have 100% ownership by external entities, and often international entities that you know, control, because they're the controlling investor, they become the controlling interest. You know, the mini grid developer may not even be based in the country where the project is being deployed. So this creates, I think, an accountability risk going forward. I'd love to see more local ownership, or even some standard around, you know, a percentage of local ownership of the systems. And even in the absence of local ownership, some kind of local decision making or accountability structures. You know, so I think we do have a lot of growth possible there in terms of better internalizing these system operations, and that manifests in various different ways. You know, as Charles suggested, outright vandalism. But otherwise, we've also seen, systems I was operating, in other countries where we have the, some of the customers, their way of implementing accountability is to show up at the office every day and complain that their meter's not working, and demand technicians calibrate their meters, multiple times per week. If they don't trust the operator of the grid, or they don't have a voice in the management of the grid, we start to see that manifest in various different ways. It's not necessarily a showstopper for these grids in the near term, but in the long term, there will need to be, accountable relationships back and forth between the developers, operators, and the communities. And we see that in terms of the developers often commenting on how they like to create and instill a sense of ownership in the community, and how they like to hire from the local community. But that's 100% voluntary at this point, and it's not always uniformly practiced, or really just the mechanisms are missing in terms of how these how this accountability is managed.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to transition. We've got a lot of questions. Thank you to my panelists.
Right, can I add something small before?
Yes, real quick, Charles, because we have to get to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Just one more from what Frank has just said about affordability. Still, one key thing that we need to see from the local ownership is the growth of the local expertise. Because, for example, in Gatirwe, as we talk now, we have young technicians coming to learn from how we operate the grid. And this is very critical for the sustainability of the mini grid, because it brings the cost of operation low when you use the local expertise from the community that the mini grid is. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charles. Okay. Again, thank you, my panelists, for answering already some of the questions online. I appreciate it. You're helping my job here, make it a little easier. I do want to go to a few of the questions that I've selected here for now. And I'll give it to whomever, one of you guys who wants to answer this question. The first one is, are developers and regulators thinking about EUL, or the effective useful life, I believe is what it stands for, of mini-grid technologies? How sustainable are they in the long run compared to legacy systems, not just financially, but also based on the materials used for the products, such as battery storage and solar panels? Which one of you would like to take this on?
I don't mind coming in briefly. Interestingly enough, you find in some cases that the infrastructure is probably more resilient than the main grid infrastructure that's in place, and they're utilizing more smart infrastructure too. In countries like Nigeria, where and maybe Lamide, you may want to chip in here, where they're sort of struggling to raise sufficient capital to rehabilitate the existing infrastructure that's in place. So the question is whether, when the main grid arrives at these mini grid sites, whether that infrastructure will be compatible with probably the newer, more advanced technology that you find that the mini grid developers have put in place. But it also depends on the mini grid developer too, where they have different standards, I guess, and the quality of infrastructure that they build.
Thank you. Lamide, you look like you have something to say.
I think so. I just add to Anita's point. So if you ask me, what would be priority for the existing grid infrastructure, I would say, focus on reinforcing the existing network, and let us as a collective embrace and accept that mini grids are here to stay for the long term. So I would flip the point and say it's not a when the grid arrives. I think it's probably more of an if the grid arrives, because mini grids are infrastructure that can last 25 years. So why are we still talking about grid coming in the first place? But if the government does choose to expand the grid to those areas, I guess certain compensation mechanisms have to be in place. I think that's just my additional point there. Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else would like to add to that? You good? Okay. So I want to talk about a little bit, one of the questions that came in that caught my attention was about how, I think all of you mentioned about how the mini grid is just one part of a larger picture, and how many different kinds of infrastructure need to be included in the planning. And so one of the questions that came in is, what are the efforts that have been taken for developing mini grid solutions for supporting food value chain in Africa, especially in rural areas? And how is this, I don't even have the answer to this, how is this forecasted to grow in the coming years? James, would you like to try to take that one on?
Sure, yeah. I was nodding my head because it's something that we are actively working on at the bank. One of the things that we're trying to do more and more is in every country where we're working, we're trying to break down the silos, break through the silos of the energy team and the agriculture team working with the ag ministry, and the energy team working with the energy ministry, and the transport team working with the transport ministry, and really try to find synergies that are sort of, when you put all the pieces together, they're better than the sum of their parts, right? So can we identify ways where mini grids can power the cold storage and even the entire cold chain, right? So this is also about recharging electric vehicles that are involved in the transport of goods to market, right? And also powering the markets themselves and powering the agricultural processing so that there's more value captured by the farming communities, right? So that they're actually able to process the goods and sell semi or sometimes even fully processed goods, up the value chain. And I think that there's a role for mini grids to play in all of these areas. And this is not it's not a secret, right? There are mini grid developers out there today who are actively supporting these agriculture value chains, whether it's cold storage or agricultural processing or e-mobility, powering entire markets for the agriculture community, fishing communities, cold storage for the fish and freezers, right? So there's a small but vibrant market for mini grids to support these agriculture value chains. And how is this going to grow? I mean, I'm hoping that they grow in lockstep, right? That modern mini grids can grow as the agriculture value chains grow, and that they can provide the sort of infrastructural stability that you would want to have to create resilient food systems. And this is particularly important for regions that are at risk of climate shocks. Water pumping, right, for irrigation is another big one. So there's lots of entry points for these modern mini grids, and I have no idea, how it's going to grow, but I hope it grows in lockstep with the ag market.
Is there can I comment on that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so we're starting to see, new and pretty exciting ways to tie in these type of studies. In one that we're doing with Anita's colleagues at SE for All, we're doing the integrated energy plan. NRECA is performing the integrated energy plan for Madagascar right now, and one of the aspects where that integrated energy plan entails a whole, geospatial least cost electrification model for the country of Madagascar, but also we have to have modules including agricultural cold chain, including medical cold chain, and including clean cooking solutions. And so looking at the integrated energy access platform has forced us to think critically about what is the role of mini grids. What if there was one of these mini grids that we're designing, based on the normal criteria of energy access, had also, a high level of clean cooking, or a high level of, in Madagascar, there's a lot of fishing. So what if we had, a cold room or some freezer system as part of the mini grid for the local community? And then there's another question of who finances that. So if the mini grid's being financed through the UEF or the traditional, financing mechanisms, is there enough capital in that for such agricultural cold chain or other agricultural processing needs? Commonly not. And so then there's an opportunity to talk about the programs we mentioned earlier about productive use financing. They're like a revolving loan fund that could be administered by a local microfinance institution rather than burdening the mini grid operator, who already has a pretty thin balance sheet and they're already operating under very heavily regulated tariffs. If you just insert new things like agricultural milling or cold storage rooms, you quickly you would need to increase the tariff to handle those transactional costs, which is commonly forbidden by regulators. So yes, I don't think you could find a mini grid on Earth that doesn't have some interaction with food value chain. Whether that's blending, using a blender to make a smoothie on the side of the road, or freezing fish. But there's that puts pressure on the financial model and on the technical viability of the system if it's not managed properly.
Just to add, completely agree with you, Frank. But just to also add the Universal Energy Facility, we do actually provide grant subsidies for standalone systems for productive use. So not necessarily mini grids, but at least systems that have capacity enough to power an appliance or equipment that would be used for agricultural produce, for example.
Thank you for that. Anybody else? Is there something you wanted to add before I move on to that? Because this seems to be a pretty interesting one. Okay.
No, please carry on. Please carry on.
Okay. All right. So let's stick with the funding for a second. And this question, and this, I'm going to try to abbreviate the question. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. Is in-country subsidies from users served by the main grid an option to fund operating costs of mini grids? And apparently this model is used in some Latin American countries. This would require the main utility or government approval of new mini grids. But it would help in sustainability, contribute to the share of high cost of mini grids among rural and urban users, so as a cost share, and reduce the need for international fund support. So what is the thought here on this? Is this an option? Yes, Anita. And Lamide, I'll come to you after that. Anita beats you out every time.
Sorry, Lamide. I think it's a fantastic idea and one that, funny enough, I haven't come across, and I'm on these panels all the time speaking about different financial innovative solutions. However, the issue is that they're trying to raise money to rehabilitate the existing grid and to extend the grid. So I wonder whether they have the capacity to be able to, use some of those funds to ensure the sustainability of the mini grids, because they're just about coping themselves. And I think in most main grids are subsidized already by the government. So I wonder whether they can then subsidize, unless we're saying the government itself would also subsidize mini grids, which is also another option if the funds are available. But in terms of the utilities being able to subsidize mini grids owned by other private sector companies, it may just be difficult because they're trying to raise sufficient capital themselves to improve the infrastructure that they're currently operating.
Okay.
Lamide.
Let me add, I would actually be interested to hear Frank's view on this, but I think this option would be in an ideal situation. Unfortunately, many African countries are not in that ideal situation. Many of us are, even my tariff in my house is heavily subsidized. So if you're transferring that tariff to me, I think that would be, it could face political backlash. If I speak from a Nigerian perspective, I think the electricity sector is still very, very, this private electricity sector is still very new. So a lot of people are still struggling with the idea of, paying a lot of money for power. So if you transfer that cost to the general, basically adding another tax, a lot of governments may not get voted in the next election. So there's a lot of political considerations to take into account. Not saying that it's not something that is, if we were to be very frank with ourselves, almost like a necessary evil, because in the end of the day, electricity is the responsibility of the government, whether through them doing it themselves, like as in the case of Nijilek, or inviting private sector. So somehow something has to give, you know. I strongly believe that over a period, I think that somehow governments and working with the development world have to come together and sort of agree on the best way that this can work, you know. And I think that that is one of many options. So just thought I should chime in there. Thanks.
And Frank Lamidi said he wants to hear what you have to say. So
Yeah, well, I think I'll first acknowledge it's a nice idea because, you know, there's the concept of like a rural electrification fund that has been implemented at least partially in some West African countries where, you know, there is, you know, some portion of the revenue collected by the utility is put into a fund that can then be used to extend the grid. However, those funds are, you know, first of all, they need to actually go to that purpose, and that could be a popular, you know, pot of money to use for other purposes, you know, in cases of, you know, if there's pressure on the energy sector in the country. Additionally, there's an allocation problem in terms of now you have this money, who does it go to, how does it, but also I think there's a misconception perhaps that electric utilities in Africa are profitable, which unfortunately they are not. You know, James and his colleagues have done great work on the quasi-fiscal deficits faced by sub-Saharan African utilities. Out of the 39 utilities in that study, 37 of them are unable to cover their cost of operation. And so if for a utility that's not able to reliably collect its tariffs, and not able to, you know, operate even at a break even in its urban infrastructure, it's very difficult to extend into rural areas without increasing and magnifying those losses, becoming more dependent on kind of bailout funds. It's you know, a bailout away from a blackout. That might not be the right entity to propel rural electrification, just because of the kind of structural dynamics of energy markets in these countries. Another thought that I've recently heard is that inherent in the utility business model is that you may have less profitable operations in rural areas, but that's offset by the more profitable operations in urban areas. So the utilities are cross-subsidizing. If they're applying a constant tariff across the country, even just by virtue of doing that, that urban customers are somehow subsidizing the rural customers. The problem with a mini-grid developer is all of their customers are in that rural area, and so the tariff is going to be higher. There's no funds coming in from some profitable urban pocket of the grid to cross-subsidize those operations in rural areas. What if mini-grid operators were given some concession area within the national grid in an urban or peri-urban area where revenues would be high relative to the rural area? Well, that's very hard to implement, and I'm not really aware of anyone who's got a serious proposal for that. But that kind of thinking might get us towards you know, the mini-grid company having sufficient scale to provide its own, not subsidy, but just provide its own revenue balancing in a diversity of operating environments. But anyways, just a thought.
okay, I'm gonna stop you there. Somebody's gonna talk really fast because this is a big question. It's gonna be the final one. We've got a couple more minutes. Question, and I'm gonna abbreviate hopefully well. Can there be a third-party layer that provides security against local currency fluctuation? Perhaps domestic finance institutions could play this role in exchange for a long-term equity position in the project itself. You guys have touched on this in bits and pieces throughout this conversation. This would be a great betting on ourselves scenario. More broadly, local finance, third-party underwriting for long-term debt finance. And the question also leads to, even when they are portfolio size, like REA efforts with NEP, can we get local underwriting scenarios going on? What is the barrier to this? This is a big question, which requires a short answer. Yes, Lamida, you got her. You beat her to it this time.
If the question was, should we? I think absolutely, and I think that that's what the guarantors of this world should be looking at. That's my answer. Thank you.
That was a good one. Good short one. James, I see you nodding. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, local currency debt is a very difficult nut to crack. Local financial institutions are it takes a lot to get them to even think about investing in a mini grid even, a portfolio of mini grid projects. They're very risk averse in this area because it's new. There maybe are some successful examples, but they're few and far between, and it's this exact kind of innovative thinking that we need more of in the sector. I mean, local currency is a nice way to protect against currency fluctuations, but it's traditionally very difficult to unlock.
I'll be honest with you, I would settle. I mean, yes, the local currency is a huge deal, but I would settle for even the insurance industry being open to, like, it's hard, building a mini grid in, for example, Haiti or any coastal environment. Couldn't even get insurance on the investment, right? There's like, not only would the insurance was too high and it wasn't feasible. No, nobody wants to provide an insurance, even something as basic as operational insurance on these assets. We have a long way to go in public acceptance within the financial sector, both in local currency, but also in just traditional services that are available to every other power utility in the world, but not to these mini grid.
That is a great point, Frank. So
Okay.
maybe that's our collective homework.
Well, or another conversation, I think. Like I said in the beginning, I feel like I'm sort of geeking out on this now because I think we could talk about this for a long time and all the different perspectives. We do have to end. It's almost 10:30. I will say to the audience that we answered a lot of the questions, I should say. If you go back to the website where you registered for this event, there's some contact information there if you have any more questions. I can certainly connect you, or USEA can also connect you to our various panelists if you want to have more conversations individually. There'll also be recordings of each of the webinars that you can also access. And I don't know that I can actually put the website link onto the chat box. Marjorie or Peter, one of you could do that. I don't think. Anyway, so thank you, everybody, and thank you for my panelists for taking the time to do this. It's been very informative and very helpful, and I'm sure our audience has learned a lot about this. And of course, before I end, I close this out, big, huge thank you to USAID, of course, and also to USEA for making this possible. And I hope we get to do this again, and I hope we get to gather all these wonderful panelists together to help us understand more about the challenges and opportunities of mini-grids in sub-Saharan Africa and other rural communities around the world. Thank you, each and every one of you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Zoraida. Thanks, everyone.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Charles.